Thank you, everyone, for sitting with us through the screening of the documentary. And we're very pleased to have the director, Andrew Ball, here with us, who's just come straight in from the airport, so we're very grateful for that. So yeah, Andrew, why don't you come up here and we can all handle the microphone. If there's any questions from the audience, they want to ask you a bit about the making of it or yeah, kind of processing all this different material. Thank you for joining us.
Sorry, I wasn't able to introduce it. Literally did come right from the airport, so U.S. Border Customs decided that I was not going to make it on time. So, but thank you for watching it. We started this talking about it just before the pandemic, and then during the pandemic, I hate using that word. We thought, well, maybe we can get it started, get it going. So we started doing interviews in 2022, 23, and then finally completed it this spring, and then screened it in summer, and here we go. We have another screening. So, any questions? All right.
Yes, there is. All right, and you can state your name.
Hello, I'm Rebecca Jansen. I am really excited to be in the same room as you because I was interviewed virtually, and people from like the journalism school or PR or something at my work were interviewing me. But I wanted to ask about the other parts of the film. Like, were these actors? How did you do that part? Like, was that in like the Mennonite Heritage Village? If you can just explain the parts that look like they were.
Yeah, that was Mennonite Heritage Village, which I use that. I've used that for a couple of other films as well, and people around the world go, How on earth did you get that? And it's like, I don't know. It's kind of like in our back pocket. You take it for granted what an incredible place that is. And then there's an old house on Wellington Crescent that we were the last people to film in. It's going to be torn down now, and that's where you see the Presidente's. And so we kind of pull things in from everywhere. It was very tough the last year working with actors. I don't know how many times you'd get the call in the morning, 8 a.m., a couple of COVID, that kind of thing. So we'd frantically try to replace them and try to just keep a set where we don't, and nobody's getting sick. So that was one of the biggest challenges.
Yeah, hi. I have a question in terms of narrative and like narrative choice of why'd you choose Mexico rather than zeroing in on the story of Paraguay? Or you have this narrative of yeah, I mean, it's very typical Dutch, then to Prussia, then to Russia, and then you really zoom in Canada, mm-hmm. and then end in Mexico essentially. But you could have just as easily stayed in Russia with the Russian Revolution, everything that happened there, and then had a different take on the Rustlanders coming to Canada or the colonies in Paraguay. So what made you choose this other stream?
That's a great question. I initially, when they talked about this group moving to Mexico, I was like, I don't know, it didn't exactly interest me, but the more we talked about it, the more I thought, actually, this is a really important story that probably doesn't get the attention that it should. And it really became really intriguing about a group that just decided that they would leave Canada. I mean, it's kind of hard for me to even process, and that's partly the reason why I kind of hesitated in the beginning. But also the Plett Foundation, they were the ones who generously helped provide the funding for this. They felt that deserved the recognition, and I agree. And the other part of this story is that the group down there is probably not going to tell this story. They don't. In fact, when we tried reaching out to them, and I said, "Hey, are there any academics down there? Any Mennonite academics?" I was kind of naive to even ask that. But there just simply wasn't, and it's sort of that line of communication just sort of died when I kept on asking them, "Hey," so yeah, I think we're the ones. Of course, it's an academic perspective, but yeah, it was a thread of our Mennonite heritage and story that might not be told in this format, and so thanks to the Plett Foundation for pushing this.
Hi, I'm Leonard Dole from Saskatchewan, and I really appreciate the film, and I sit on the Plett Foundation board as well, so I do have a certain bias to this whole thing. but I'm so glad that the story is being told. And the people that were part of the film were very articulate in terms of telling the story from the beginning, in terms of building an understanding of why the story is important right up to the present as well. So kudos to you as well, and for a job well done. The photography is good, the storyline I appreciate, and anyway, I'm hoping that we can have a launch in Saskatchewan as well, because this is very much our story as well, in terms of how it impacted people from our own community, my family, Abe's family, other, and others that, and I'm hoping that this will help to build some understanding in our own communities about why things have turned out the way they have. And this being the 100th anniversary, it's significant that the timing is now as well. So thanks.
Oh, thank you. It's also interesting, I mean, the different Mennonite groups. I mean, growing up, I only thought there was Roostlanders, but now understanding not just there's other groups that had other very different stories. The ones that came out of Russia during the Second World War, I mean, there's a very different story. But also this group, at the end, I really began to find it quite intriguing, but also the relationships they had with each other, with the sort of do-si-do that the Roostlanders did, moving in as they move out. And I think Conrad States put it as Mennonites are just a people on the move. And yeah, when you look at the map and how things just constantly migrate and change, it's fascinating. Mm-hmm.
So about the content of it, so who wrote the narratives? So who wrote the script for it?
Kind of me. Okay. It was like sitting down with these academics, and almost like unpacking something that just never stops unpacking itself. These are people who dedicated a significant amount of time to researching this and studying it, and so you basically start with some very basic questions, and usually it's just they tell the story, and so it's just more interweaving them, and all of them were incredibly complimentary to this group. It is an interesting story. It is a different story. I found it, a little hard at first to understand, like, why would you leave Canada? But also putting my mind into their perspective, and also their history, so yeah, and they were all, obviously great in explaining that journey that they had in these people. So.
Yeah, great. Because it was very, very coherent, clear. I mean, it's like they all wrote it for you. So
they kind of did.
It was great. So my other question is, how is this going to be able to be accessed in the future?
That's a good question. The Platt Foundation is going to make it accessible. I think I would imagine if you want to screen this for educational purposes, you're going to get it to screen it, and then you'll have to ask the Platt Foundation where else. There's also a couple of other options that we're presenting to get broadcasts and all that in the next little while as well. Hopefully, the more people that can access it, the better. I think that's, and thankfully, because of the internet now, that can be done. So.
I think it should be translated into Low German.
We just did Volendam. I don't know if you've seen Volendam. It's the story of the Mennonites that came out of Russia during the Second World War. The Paraguayan colonies said, hey, we're going to help you. We're going to translate it all. And then we had somebody from Winnipeg here who could properly read it. And we actually dubbed over German through the whole thing. And then 3 weeks later, the documentary got picked up in Germany, and they dubbed their German, which was better, according to the Germans. So, but I learned the lesson that Low German and German in the Mennonite community is very nuanced, and we had a service initially translate that particular project to German, and everybody said, yeah, this is unusable. I'm like, okay. So we went to the Paraguayan group, and then Germany did their own thing. So that kind of scares me, but I understand why it's important to do that. So. Okay. Okay. You've just illustrated the whole point.
Thank you for the film. My name is Tracy Hureska. I've got a question about the editorial process. There are two kind of contradictory themes that come up in different academics' presentations that were also shot through all of the presentations today, and I'm guessing will come up again tomorrow. So I'm curious about it, not just here, but how you chose to select snippets of people speaking for the inclusion. And the two kind of contrasting or contradictory themes are, we have moved a lot, we are used to moving around, we can migrate again, we're good at this, no problem. And the other half of that is, it is an incredible hardship to sell everything and to start all over again.
Yep.
And I'm wondering, like, how did you decide how to put those things together?
Well, with respect, I didn't want to, I mean, because I think why they're doing it is genuine, the point of why they're doing it. And so it was very carefully put together. But I know that's one thing that kind of always gnawed at me, that it's almost as though they didn't understand how much they were leaving behind to get a community to build that land and build all those assets and then leave it and then do it again in many respects as they move forward. To me, that's very interesting, and it's very curious, and I don't even know how to answer how you could do that, especially for the women and children who probably didn't have quite the say in this move. Well, I mean, we make the point, there's that wonderful letter that says, like, the bishops are kind of like, they're hell-bent on moving. Did they really understand what they were sacrificing? So much labor, so much time that in building these communities. I don't know, that's one of the, I think the part of this story is that they're very genuine on some level, but also they maybe don't realize how hard it is. Exactly what you say, there's these two stories fighting with each other. And that's also, I think, what kind of intrigues me to this story.
Thank you. On that last comment, I keep thinking the Mennonites move over to Manitoba, say that's in my own background, in 1875, 1880. Go to 1920. That's 40 years. They left everything, a lot of them, because those were the poor landless Mennonites that moved during that time, not the well-to-do estate owners, which then left and came here with varying degrees of wealth, or none. But that's why I keep thinking, the more I read or hear about this, that belief must have been the strongest motivator, because the idea that, we can start it, we'll do it all over again in a new country and learn a new language, it's always been resisting the culture, the language. So the belief that religion, belief in God, belief that this is what he wants, and interpreting various parts of the Bible that I don't think would be interpreted that way today by the bishops. Just seems to me that this whole thing was far more important from the leadership of the bishops, the interpretation, and then the people following, sort of like Moses and the children of Israel following his teaching. And we know the hardships, if you read the Bible, literally, those hardships, the same thing. And did you get that sense from the historical perspective at all, or the literature, or the articles and so on?
Well, I mean, you can see the articles, they're written by usually the men. It's, we touched on a little bit when they go down to Mexico, how the hardships, and you can, if you, we kind of, it would be a whole other documentary to go what happened in Mexico and why they kept on moving and moving down to Belize and moving to all these other, and we kind of like, I talked to Aileen with that, and we're like, this is going to be too much to unpack. And we're going to be sitting here for 2 hours watching this story. And we wanted to make it a little more contained. And that's why we didn't go any further. We kind of summarize. Because then you also get into the complications of, the whole economic changes they made, right? They suddenly jumped into NAFTA and said, okay, well, we can do this. We can adapt our machinery. We can adapt our whole farming process and go headlong. That's a whole other story to unpack. Well, how did they reconcile that with their beliefs that brought them there? And so we kind of left that off the table. That's a discussion for another day, but I think a valid discussion as well. And then sort of the groups moving. There's a great BBC documentary. I'm pretty sure it's still on the internet. It follows a family moving from the Mexican colony, I believe, to Belize. And it is very eye-opening. The BBC crew just spends a lot of time with them, and they kind of sneak on their phones that they're listening to music and they're doing all kinds of things on the internet. But then the brother pulls up on the road and they hide everything. Well, for them not to realize that you have a BBC crew there that's going to be like showing this to the world, like they did not connect, and it was really interesting. And then they also traveled with tens of thousands of dollars, their whole life savings in cash on them, on planes and through airports and then the BBC showing this. Mennonites are traveling throughout South America loaded with cash. It just showed sort of how naive they maybe were about the whole process. It's well worth watching, and they're torn. You can see there's this tension. You know, they can listen to country music on an iPhone on their table, but they shouldn't. But they do. So it's well worth checking out.
Kind of tagging on to what you're just talking about, where there is a lot of wider audience interest in the Mennonite story. BBC has done several documentaries. I've watched several YouTube news channels on Mennonites in Bolivia or Colombia. So are you going to have any plan or efforts to distribute this to maybe a wider audience, or try and make connections? Because this is also a part of Canadian history.
Yeah. Well, I think, and of course there's also the idea that a people stood up against the government, which this last 3 years we've had groups standing up against the government, mandates, that kind of thing. So it's kind of an interesting discussion point, right? And especially for religious reasons. So we want to make it as widely available as possible. And, of course, with the internet today, that's very easy. But especially for educational purposes. So if a school teacher or professor wants to use it, getting it in their hands is going to be very easy. But I will say this also, the BBC documentary was very interesting, that they did not distinguish that there were other Mennonites out there. It's an hour-long documentary. They just kept referring to them as Mennonites, and it's like, well, wait a minute, as we all know in this room, that's it's kind of like the Jewish community. There's so many in the spectrum, different types of ideas and people within that name, and the BBC just sort of presented us like, very, very conservative, basic people in Mexico, and that's not true. But that's, journalism sometimes. So. Anyone else?
I think we had one question from the webinar viewers, and it was sort of just to summarize briefly this idea about how making the film made you consider the idea of education, both education from like sort of a British colonial national project and education as a sort of ethno-religious identity project, either side.
Well, I mean, it was interesting growing up as a kid, right, in this British colonial. I mean, even in the 80s, there was still that echo of, the Queen's up there, and you do a lot of things that are from, growing up in a former colony, the Dominion of Canada. But this was a little bit different to see it from the other perspective, and to see how, like, bringing the right kind of people in and building up the nation, and then building up with the right language and all that I found that was really fascinating. Actually, that was a different perspective that I'm walking away with. So I did also find it a little concerning that this group of Mennonites down there aren't able to really articulate their own story, so we have to do it for them. And I don't think they realize what they've lost by doing that. Not. They don't have their own academics to study themselves and to, I think that's important. And I think that's a little bit of a tragedy with this group down there.
Well, I think if there's no more questions, we'll just thank Andrew very much for his time and rushing over here.
Thank you.